today to raise the issue of the role of Canada in shaping offshore jurisdictions in the Caribbean, and also in the fact of becoming itself a tax haven like its creator. But before, I would like to talk about the issue of tax havens as such. What are they? How can we define them? Why can we be concerned about them? Maybe a word before I start. I studied in philosophy, and sometimes it can be strange or surprising to see that from the point of view of the philosophy, one would have something to say on a type of issue such as tax havens. I think I would say that tax havens represent a so important issue that it should be that no sole discipline should consider to be allowed to talk about it in an exclusive way. I mean, tax havens are related to issues that are interesting to, of course, law, economy, fiscality, but also sociology, psychoanalysis, aesthetic, history, anthropology, and of course philosophy. And from my point of view, what I think interesting in the tax havens is that they are so important. They represent a so huge and vast problem that they are nowadays, I would say, transforming the meaning as such of the words we commonly use to talk about geopolitics. When we talk about geopolitics with words such as, or notions or concepts such as borders, law, states, crime, legitimacy, sovereignty, and all these words are nowadays having relatively new definitions, new meanings in a world in a way dominated by tax havens. And this is why I thought that working in a philosophical way on tax havens was I would say to become conscious of a new framework in which political problems are raised today. And I would say that the previous book I wrote, Offshore, Tax Havens and the Rule of Global Crime, is meant to take into account all those approaches to talk about tax havens. And I would say that there are 4 reasons to feel concerned about tax havens if we consider the issue in those among those disciplines. It would be for issues related to fiscality, sociology, criminology, and I would say politics. The first aspect related to tax havens is, of course, the fiscal problem. As we name them, tax havens are related to the tax issue. I mean, usually when we read about them in the media, it's about individuals that take advantage of some jurisdictions called tax havens to avoid taxation. When I talk about tax havens, I guess that you have in mind spontaneously all kind of jurisdictions, and you know the tax havens are the Bermudas, the Cayman Islands, the Bahamas, in the Caribbean. If you go in Europe, you'll have Luxembourg, the Liechtenstein, the Switzerland, of course, Monaco, and in Asia, there's the Singapore or the Marshall Islands. We find about 80 or 90 of them, and tax havens, usually when we define them, are jurisdictions meant to allow no taxation on operation registered there, Also, there is nothing such as a legal system working in a way that we would consider it seriously in a democracy. I mean, law is meant to allow everything to corporations or wealthy people that have the means to register assets there or to create entities or subsidiaries there. Also, tax havens are defined by the secrecy that is allowed in these jurisdictions. I mean, it's almost impossible for a judge or for researchers or for states to know what is formally going on in a tax havens. If a corporation based in Canada creates a subsidiary in the Bahamas, it's not possible for Canadian public servants, for instance, to know what's happening with that particular subsidiary in the tax haven. And also, tax havens are countries where nothing concretely happens. I mean, it's all about creating corporations on paper and to move assets on paper. I mean, concretely, the corporations or the wealthy people that use tax havens remain in financial center. I mean, they are in Toronto, they are in New York, in Boston, in Frankfurt, in London, in Paris, and they use tax haven entities from there just to officially, formally, legally be outside the country where they really operate, to avoid laws, to avoid constraints, to circumvent all kind of constraints that actually characterize the fact of living in a society. And I would say that the first aspect why tax havens are so problematic is the fiscal one, because they allow huge corporations and wealthy individuals to circumvent their tax obligations. Usually we talk about, well, for a long time ago, we were used to hear about tax havens, about individuals cheating while using the Cayman Islands or the Barbados. But the social dimension of tax havens as a problem is the fact that corporations use them in a very ordinary manner. A former Minister of Finance in Quebec once said, if a corporation pays taxes in Canada, it's because it has a very bad accountant. Actually, and here or elsewhere, it's very easy for a corporation to move assets to tax havens to avoid taxation. One of the techniques that corporations use to do so is what we call the transfer pricing. It's a way for a corporation to move, to transfer assets, funds in subsidiaries in the tax havens, so that it can declare to the fiscal authorities that they have no profit or almost no profit. It's quite simple for corporations to create a subsidiary, to sell to the subsidiary some assets like cars, like the property of a factory, or the property rights on trademarks, to sell them to subsidiaries in tax havens and then to pay bills to their own subsidiaries, because they don't, the local entity where the corporation actually operates formally doesn't own its own assets. Its own assets are being owned by the subsidiaries. So you'll see a corporations like Google paying in 2011. I mean, Google is one of the wealthiest corporations in the world. It's a corporation that makes billions of dollars a year, and in 2011, in the whole world, the company only paid 2.4% tax because the company was able to transfer assets in Ireland, in Netherlands, in the Bermudas, and elsewhere, and to make as if its operation were actually being done there. They were able that year to transfer almost $10 billion in the Bermudas. And I don't know how many employees they have there, but it should be sort of Skatanov that work in a very powerful way to generate all that income. And well, actually, you see like corporations like Apple, like Starbucks, and like Amazon also doing that. And here we heard recently in Quebec about Bombardier, or other corporations that also work toward. They all do this. I mean, it's part of what students in business school learn when they study in the corporate fiscality, while being in an institution financed by public funds, by the way. And it's very common to practice these type of strategies. And of course, the problem is that corporations pay they provide only 10% of the public budget when it was 40% a few decades ago. And that is why we have all these budgets related to austerity, all these spend cuts, because government make as if there was a problem with spending, as if we were, as a society, spending too much on public services, although the problem is related to the revenue, to the income of the state, and it's not a problem about spending. So, and the problem is, it's more like, it would be a philosophical problem if we think about what Georg Simmel said about fiscality. It's about the fact that a corporation is still nowadays, still on a, I would say, liberal perspective or neoliberal perspective, a corporation still needs public infrastructures to operate. I mean, when an investor comes to Halifax, this private investor, this individual that has, or this corporation that has money to invest, has an airport, roads, schools, universities, public institutions related to health, a social system that guarantee social peace, a court of justice when they can settle conflicts and also have the right to gain money almost in an illimited way. I mean, investors need, even in a liberal point of view, all these infrastructures, but they manage to avoid the bill. This is one of the problems I would see with respect to taxation. The second problem is related to, I would say, in a broad way, social issues. I don't like the expression tax haven, because in French it's paradis fiscaux, in German it's Steueroasen. It's always about recycling the colonialist aesthetic of the 19th century, because a lot of tax havens are former colonies. And so we talk about these islands with these exotic trees and sunsets, and we think about them as being paradise. And I also think that if we say in French paradise, it's because we translated not haven but heaven. There was a mistake in the translation, so I think the translator said, "Oh, it must be heaven." And actually, I don't like this expression for that particular reason, but also because the expression only focuses on tax. And well, tax havens are, I would say, I call them jurisdictions of convenience. I mean, in all kind of sectors and on issues, they allow wealthy individuals and huge corporations to avoid not only their fiscal obligations, but all kind of constraints, of legal constraints. And that's why we find so many of them. I mean, if there are 80 or 90 tax havens in the world, it's because they all have a field of expertise. We should see tax havens a bit like shops in the mall. I mean, they all have their expertise, and some are small, some you have like big surfaces like the Bermudas or the Panama, they do almost everything. And you have like small tax havens like Ireland that are specialized in something. But one must know that they all operate to offer legal and fiscal advantages to corporations working in specific areas. So they aren't all the same. Also in the fiscal, with respect to fiscal issues, they are particular. I mean, for instance, Liechtenstein is specialized in the tax avoidance of German taxpayers because they are neighbors. And they shaped the law so that it would allow easily German taxpayers to avoid taxation. It's the same with Switzerland and France, or Monaco and France, depending on the type of taxpayer. And of course, Canada has also its tax haven is Barbados. Barbados was meant to allow wealthy Canadians and Canadian corporations to circumvent the tax system. And everything was done to allow that in a legal way by the Canadian government. I will talk about that. But this is one of the problems also with other issues. I mean, in the insurance company, of course, managers will go in the Bermudas or in Turk and Caicos because these two jurisdictions are meant to allow reinsurance, to circumvent all kind of laws. Nations and parliaments vote to give a framework to that specific area. To risky financial investments, it's the Cayman Islands. All the hedge funds are there. I mean, a lot of them are in the Cayman Islands because they can invest without having any, without supporting any kind of control from a public institution. In the banking sector in Europe, we'll go to Luxembourg. The Jersey Island is meant to individuals working abroad. We heard last year that the actual Prime Minister of Quebec, when he was in Saudi Arabia, opened a bank account in the Jersey Island. Ireland, as I have said, is meant to attract property rights and also property rights on the scientific field, in the corporation field, and also with respect to major artists. And that's why in the 90s you saw all these artists having all of a sudden passionate relationships to Ireland because they could register their assets there without paying tax. For the oil transport is the Marshall Island. For the to bet on games, it's Singapore. Pharmaceutical is Côte d'Ivoire, and so on. And the mining industry is located in Canada. I mean, 75% of the world mining companies are in Canada, not because they like Putin or whatever, but it's because of the regulation or the lack of regulation that Canada provides this industry that comes here from abroad and operate also abroad. They just use the corporation in a formal way. So all countries, not only the exotic jurisdictions, but all the countries nowadays kind of transform a part of their jurisdiction in an offshore way to attract capital. And of course, the one who are losing in all this is the populations. Because the populations see these laws that are meant to structure life in society being always circumvented by powerful actors. The third point is related to criminology, of course. Criminal masterminds in all kind of fields, very important fields: arms dealing, drug trafficking, corruption, political corruption, prostitution, pornographical networks, counterfeiting. All these networks use tax havens because it's by these networks it is possible to benefit from the impunity. I mean, no law applies. And it's not, we're not talking about parallel economies, marginal funds, but about activity that, if the principal dealers were unified, would have to be in the G20 because they manage a lot of assets. And the problem with tax havens is not only that tax havens facilitate the management, I would say, of all those criminal files, but they also facilitate money laundering. And money laundering, I mean, all the tactics, all the strategies these major players have to take the money from the drug dealings and invest it into real estate in New York, in Toronto, in Halifax, in Montreal, in Paris, and elsewhere, or to work a bit in the legal system and a bit in the illegal one without having any problem to transfer money from type of activity to another one. And in France, it's interesting to read work that Justice de Maillard did. He's a judge working currently in France in the legal system, and he writes a book about tax havens because he's concerned about the fact that he says that quite clearly, that nowadays it's impossible to distinguish l'argent sale, I mean, criminal money from legal money. And it's a judge seeing that it's impossible to inquire to be sure that when an investor arrives in a city, that the funds this investor has are legal. And the fourth point would be related to political issues. Nowadays, more than 50% of the world financial transactions go through tax havens. It's not something marginal at all. I mean, the world, the capitalism as we know it today is managed in countries where no law applies. It's as simple as that. And the problem, I will quote someone else, Marie-Christine Dupuy-Danon. She worked at the UN against money laundering for years, and she wrote in the book, Criminalité, Finance Criminelle, I don't think it was translated, Financial Criminality. She said that today, when a corporation has in mind to do something illegal, the only thing this corporation has to do is register a subsidiary, its activities, where all of a sudden what's illegal in the country they operate become legal. And all tax havens and jurisdictions of convenience all actually sell impunity. They sell anomie, an absence of legal constraints. They sell that actually. And I would say that one of the problems we have today is to consider the fact that Canada, and this is the second point I would like to raise, Canada played historically an instrumental role in transforming Caribbean overseas territories into tax havens. after the Second World War. And some of the most controversial tax havens, the Bahamas, the Cayman Islands, are the work, the chef-d'oeuvre, the work of Canadians. We have to remember that Canada as a colony was very convenient with the banking sector in its history. In the 19th century, bankers that didn't consider themselves as Canadian, but as coming from Scotland or England or Ireland, I mean, they wouldn't have never say that they are Canadians. As a Swiss banker that operates in the Bahamas will never say that he's Bahamian. I mean, these bankers from the United Kingdom presenting themselves as coming from Scotland or England or Ireland used Canada as, I would say, a tax havens before the exist to operate in the banking sector in a free manner. Also, with in comparison with what happened in the United States, where the banking sector was strongly regulated, it was interesting for bankers to go to Canada to operate in the banking sector, because it was one was able from Canada to create elsewhere in the world offices and to operate in a very free manner, which wasn't the case in the U.S. Though there was a lot of the Canadian banks had a lot of clients in the U.S. Because they were able to support their investment in the Caribbean, where there was already an important Canadian presence, because since decades, commercial relationships existed between the Maritimes, especially Halifax, and the Caribbean islands. So there was already relationships. So Canadian banks were quite strong in the Caribbean, and also the London, the colonial bank, that had as a mandate to take care, I would say, of the financial operations in the Caribbean, asked the Halifax Business Company to actually manage, as a manager, let's say, managed effectively all this sector. So Canadians were, at the beginning, in the colonial point of view, dealing with financial aspects in the Caribbean right at the beginning. So they had a very important presence in the Caribbean. And until the 80s, between 60 and 90% of the financial institutions in the Caribbean were Canadians. And like, if you say, it's just an anecdote, but if you look at the novel of John Grisham, The Firm, which is about the Caribbean tax havens, because Grisham is a former lawyer and he's aware about, I would say, vraisemblance. Yeah, you want to be seem realistic. All the banks he has in his novel are Canadian banks, but they are false ones. It's the Royal Bank of Montreal, it's the Bank of Ontario. I mean, they don't exist. But to look realistic, he chose to. And if you see the movie that was made with that film, you see all these corporations, and if you see some James Bond film too, when James Bond is in Bahamas, you always see these Canadian flags everywhere. I mean, and it's just details, but it shows that the Canadian presence is something quite known, because movie makers use the Canadian reference to make it real, to make it look real when they create, when they present the situation. Anyway, in the 60s, in the 50s, sorry, after the Second World War, and this is where it all begins, something new happened in the world economy, and it is a Marshall Plan. I mean, Europe was destroyed. We know that the U.S. administration invested $14 billion in the European economy, creating a whole market, especially for US corporations. We can understand that. But all this money invested in Europe was managed by institutions that for the first time of the history dealt with currency that wasn't controlled by any state. It was like money floating. Because you had French investors, German investors, British investors, Spanish investors managing US dollars. And this is what we call the euro market, the euro dollars. Because the US didn't want at all this money to come back in the US after Europe was, the infrastructures were rebuilt. Because it would have created inflation and so on. And they also wanted that currency to become the currency of reference in the world. And this is why at that time the US authorities were saying, the dollar is our money, but it's your problem. Because you have some. And it's in your interest that this currency remains powerful. So when the US dollars was becoming weak in the history, we knew that at the Fed, the responsible were playing cards and looking at movies. I mean, they didn't care because they knew that in Japan, in France, in Germany, everybody had interest in keeping this money very strong. But it also led to this globalized economy, where you have all this capital between hands of corporations that aren't at all controlled by any kind of states. And that's how and why at the beginning of the 50s, tax havens started to emerge, because it was to give the investors that had access to all this world capital free from any kind of control, to have like a political framework that is totally permissive to do whatever they want with that money. And so it started to be interesting to create these tax havens, or to use some of these small jurisdictions, allowing all kind of operations. And also, it may sound anecdotal, but also in the US, there was all this issue around Al Capone, who was caught with fiscal practices. So in the criminal circles in the US, the major dealers that were in these fields understood that they had advantages. They should move their assets outside the US in all kind of jurisdictions like Switzerland, like Cuba, to launder the money outside the US. And in Cuba, there were all these casinos that couldn't work anymore after 1959 because something happened there that didn't make them functional anymore. So they moved in the Bahamas. And what did you have in the Bahamas? You have a minister of finance and of tourism, and in the Bahamas, being a minister of tourism is more important than being a minister of finance, because you deal with all these casinos and hotel. And well, the minister, which is Sir Stafford Sands, welcomed on one hand the euro dollars, and on the other hand the criminal money of the US dealers. And managing with, with all kind of characters. I don't have the time to present them. And that is to say that Canadian banks, like the Scotia Bank or the Royal Bank of Canada, invested in some casino or hotel projects in the Bahamas at that time. And they were also increasing their activity in such islands. And this minister I talked about, Sir Stafford Sands, was Minister of Finance and Tourism, and at the same time he was a member of the board of the Royal Bank of Canada here. So he could, during the day, manage its jurisdiction in a way the bank he was managing in the evening could have dreamed it, in the way it could have dreamed it. And in these particular years, the Scotia Bank was represented in the Bahamas by Donald Fleming, which is a former Minister of Finance of Canada under Diefenbaker. And actually, I mean, you'll read the book if you want, there are a lot of quotes saying that he was a major player when the Bahamas changed their legislation with respect to fiscal and law issues with corporations. I mean, he was a counselor, so to say, an unofficial counselor to the government. And a lot of bad things happened in the U.S., the IRS, because in the U.S., the authorities were always concerned about what was happening with Canadian banks, but never the federal government. The federal government always supported Canadian banks in the Caribbean. But in the United States, the IRS started to see that something was going wrong with Canadian banks and casinos and hostels in the Bahamas. So they started to put under pressures all kind of players. And there are anecdotes about a Canadian banker being in Florida and and he was caught by the U.S. authorities. And in court, he said, well, I cannot talk about it because the law in the Bahamas doesn't allow me to talk about what I do there. And there was all these kind of problems. And when it started to be too rough, a Canadian lawyer from Alberta, Jim McDonald, created the same type of jurisdiction, but in the Cayman Islands. And we saw some financial institutions moving their files to the Cayman Islands to make it more complicated to the U.S. authorities to sue some corporations or to make inquiries. And there are a lot of details also that we know about Canadian banks being involved in that, transfer. And Jim McDonald was the very clearly mind of this transformation, with other Canadians being there in the real estate. And we can mention that formally, but it didn't work, former first governor in our history of the Bank of Canada, Graham Towers, after he retired from the Bank of Canada, went to Jamaica in the 50s to shape all kind of laws. And it was meant to transform Jamaica, which was the major island of the Caribbean at that time in a geopolitical point of view, to transform Jamaica into a tax haven. But there was, I would say, nationalistic movement there, and an anti-colonialist movement that didn't allow the project to be led. And in the 80s, it continued. I mean, the Canadian government signed in 1980 a treaty with the Barbados. It was called, as we know them, a treaty against double taxation for corporations. And these treaties make sense when they are signed with normal jurisdiction. I mean, if Canada signs a treaty with Germany against double taxation, it means that Bombardier, that has an affiliate, a subsidiary in Berlin, doesn't pay tax on the same income if they move it from Germany to Canada. I mean, if Bombardier makes a bit of money in Germany and they pay tax on that income, it's normal that they don't pay tax twice if they bring back the money into Canada. This is the meaning of these agreements. But when Canada signs an agreement with the Barbados, where the tax rate is from 1% or even less, it's as if the corporation that was moving money to the Barbados and bringing it back had already paid tax. And they will say, well, it's disgusting, I paid already 1% tax, I won't pay tax again. But actually, it was meant to allow this flow of money, and that's why nowadays $60 billion, according to Statistic Canada, from Canadian corporations are in the Barbados as direct investment, in foreign direct investment in the Barbados. And if we look at the data, we could think that the Barbados will welcome soon the Olympic Games, and that they are building states and hotels and airports, because it is made as if there were economical investment in the Barbados, when it's only a funnel to avoid taxation. And this stats is very conservative, because Statistic Canada, of course, doesn't have the means to inquire on what is happening in tax havens, so they only gather the information that the corporations give to the agency. So, but they aren't able to verify. So it's a minimal data. And I mean, we could talk a lot about this, and the actual, and I would like to talk about Nova Scotia, and we could talk a lot about this. The only thing I want to raise here is that Canada always, after having shaped these tax havens, always helped Canadian corporations to benefit from them, creating loopholes for corporations, creating all kind of legal ways to allow corporations to have access to tax havens. And it cost us a lot, because Statistic Canada considers today that $170 billion are registered in tax havens with the methodology I talked about. So it means that all these billions aren't taxed. So we lose money, but we also lose money in a second way, which is that to remain competitive against the tax havens Canada contributed to create, we lower the tax rate on the corporate income here. So we have also, by that way, less money in the public coffer. The tax rate in the 1981 on the federal level was, I think, 38%, and it's now 15%, because we have to remain competitive. And there are a lot of discourse saying Canada has to remain competitive. No tax. We'll lower the taxes. We'll abolish some taxes. We'll create a program to defer the moment where corporations will pay taxes. So you have corporations like Molson, or at some years they are negative, and so on and so forth. Because Canada and KPMG and PricewaterhouseCoopers always, year after year, quote Canada as being one of the countries where the fiscal environment, as they put it, is the most advantageous one for corporations. So we stand of becoming a tax haven that way, and also the third way that it cost the population a lot to have these tax havens operating abroad is that is all the problem of the debt, because we borrow money from institutions that we don't tax anymore. So there is all this money that's leaving, so we don't tax it, and because we want to keep the rest of the capital here to attract it, well, we lower the tax rates. And to finance the public services that we are not able to finance anymore, we borrow money to them. And so we pay them money to be able to finance the public institution they need to exploit us when they invest here. And often the government will say, well, we shouldn't tax the capital because the capital needs money to create jobs, to support the economy. Well, that's absolutely false, because in their bank accounts, the bank deposit, as we do when we go put our check in our bank account, the banking deposit of corporations is about $630 billion. I mean, they have plenty of money. And if they invest it, it's in financial products created in the Cayman Islands, or in factories that they built in India, in Jamaica, in Haiti, in China, where what they will call the labor cost, which is a helpful concept, is lower. So anyway, the population always pay the price, and a lot of time. And Canada is supporting that system quite actively. Now, you may know that the institution of Bretton Woods, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, don't work at all like the UN. Countries don't have a seat. Seats are shared by a group of countries. And Canada shares its seat at the World Bank and the IMF, still today, with 12 tax havens. Ireland and 11 tax havens from the Caribbeans, the Bahamas, the Barbados, Belize, St. Kitts and Nevis, Saint Vincent and Grenadines, and a lot of these countries are considered drug states by the U.S. authorities. And actually, the Canadian government lobbies in these financial institutions to support these tax havens. Unfortunately, I only have the translation in French, but on April 25th of 2009, Jim Flaherty went, 1 year after the financial crisis that we know, went to these institutions to support the tax havens he was representing, talking on their behalf and saying, Canada shares its seat with tax havens, and you should know that they are clear and transparent and everything goes fine, so we don't need any kind of law. And this is, we mentioned it in the book. This is one of the book will be released in April, by the way. It's just one of the quotes that says a lot. And I won't say much more. The idea, and this is what I wanted to talk about, it's just a long introduction. The idea is that, but I'll be short. The idea is that Canada helped the financial institution and the major industries to shape these tax havens. He supported the use of these tax havens, and he sort of became like its creatures. We could talk about British Columbia and the drug dealings. We could talk about Alberta as a petrostate. We could talk about Ontario being the legal haven of choice of the world mining companies, giving all kind of advantages that they don't find anywhere. And I wrote that book about it, Imperial Canada Inc. It's just about Ontario and this specific, haven. And Quebec also, but with respect to the exploitation of mining, not the management aspect of the mining industries in the world, but about digging and extracting ore in very advantageous conditions. And also with respect to video games, Montreal is like the haven of this particular file. And finally, we can mention Nova Scotia. In 2006, Nova Scotia, and a bit before, created the Nova Scotia Business Inc., which is a business development agency created by the government, but managed exclusively by private members. And they have as a mandate to attract institutions in financial services and insurance sector here. Nova Scotia Business Inc. is a public organization of a very particular kind. It is described as a private sector-led. Established in 2001, Nova Scotia Business Inc. works to attract the Nova Scotia companies active in the finance, technology, aerospace, and weapons sector. Nova Scotia offers corporations payroll rebates amounting to 5% to 10% of eligible gross payroll. Nova Scotia also gives tax credit for research and development equivalent to 15% of expenditures, to which are added deduction of a similar nature from the federal government for 20 to 35% of expenditures. These subsidies add to up to one of the most rewarding research and development tax credit programs in the world. Deductions which may reach 50% of expenditures covered many types of expenditures incurred in Canada and abroad, such as salaries. Rebates are paid by the Nova Scotia government in cold hard cash. The government boasts of providing business with qualified accounting experts and fostering synergy between the private sector and the universities. I will give examples of corporations coming from Bermudas to Halifax to benefit from these governmental programs, so that we see that things are going the other way around. It's not northern, western capital that go to tax havens to colonialize those islands. It's the firms that were created by the financial institutions that come here to have access to the working skills of people, because in the Bermudas it costs a lot to hire accountant there. Real estate is a very important problem in the Bermudas, and also there's a lack of accountants, so they come here to do the back office work. But the accountants work here thanks to these fiscal incentive of the government on files that are still existing under the Bermudan law. So you have investors from the US creating subsidiaries in the Bermudas to avoid taxation, and that the work that has to be done there is actually made in Halifax in these back office, but under the law of Bermudas. And it's always about creating jobs. So I'll give you some examples. I read my notes because it's the translator did it. It's well written and it will be better than my approximative English. The government boasts of providing businesses with qualified accounting expert and fostering synergy between the private sector and universities. The Castle Hall Alternatives Hedge Funds is a perfect illustration. In 2010, the company chose to incorporate in Nova Scotia to benefit from tax holidays worth approximately $1.5 million in exchange for a commitment to hire 50 employees for 6 years. In December 25, a Bermuda firm, West End Capital Management, expanded the Halifax operation it has established in 1998. Among the specialties of this financial management firm are derivatives, the ultra-speculative products, sold to investors gambling on changes in the value of shares or resources over time. Nova Scotia Business Inc. promised over $500,000 over 3 years through payroll rebates to support the creation of 50 jobs within the company. In other words, West End was to get Halifax employees to manage $1 billion while still enjoying the full benefits of Bermuda's lack of regulation. In November 2006, 3 other hedge funds with headquarters in Bermuda, Citco Group, Butterfield Fund Services, and Olympia Capital, also opened offices in Halifax. Citco is in a position to hire qualified staff at little expenses, was soon back for more, opening in Halifax office and training center in 2007. In September 2009, it established a corporation residency MBA at Dalhousie University. More public money was now at its disposal to train future employees. The company opened its first North American real estate investment funds practice in January 2011 and increased its staff again in April 2011. Butterfield Fund Services has a similar story. The company is happy to have access to the many, I'm quoting, the many universities and colleges in the Halifax area that provide a large pool of qualified young candidates from which we can recruit, end quote. specializing in cross-management of offshore funds in a variety of tax havens. Butterfield Fund Services, Bermuda, provides a range of accounting, corporate, trustee, and shareholder services to offshore hedge funds, mutual funds, and pension funds. The company provides third-party fund administration service in Bermuda, Cayman, and Guernsey, as well as in Hong Kong, and register and transfer agency service, as well as multi-currency net asset valuation and production of fund account services. And well, they work here. The third Bermuda hedge fund that came to Halifax in the fall of 2006 was Olympia Capital. This company was set to collect $1.5 million from the Nova Scotia government in payroll rebates, as well as $3,100 offered by the province Office of Economic Development as a recruitment and training incentive package, as it was said. Olympia Capital is a controversial firm in 2011. An investment banker accused of having acted in the 1990s to help a Japanese camera manufacturer conceal losses at the area of $1 billion. Another Bermuda hedge fund, Median Fund Services, arrived in Halifax 2 months later in 2007 to open operational support office. The firm, which described itself as a provider of strategic financial services, offer a full range of service to hedge funds established in offshore jurisdiction, end quote. It has offices in New York, where a significant proportion of its customers are to be found, and in the Cayman Islands, a jurisdiction that attracts over 80% of the world's offshore funds, in addition to supporting the valuation, accounting, and investor relations need of our other office. Our Halifax office is our major data processing center. I'm reading a bit fast because I want to exchange a bit. I have a lot of examples, but they are all look-alike. It's always about dealing with funds registered in tax havens while working here, and they call that nearshore. And nearshore is an advantaged way to benefit from offshore system because Halifax claimed to be near to the United States, where actually the operations are managed. Yeah, I will end it here. But all those, this example is interesting to understand the offshore topic as being a major one. And I would say that on a political point of view, the offshore phenomenon is as important as climate change in the ecological point of view. And it would be unrealistic to think that with a simple technical solution, we could settle things. It's a political problem that shouldn't discourage anyone. And I think that the idea is to see how it's possible to tackle this problem while understanding it properly, and understanding it as being a problem mentioned as we do it today everywhere in the world, in a lot of fields. It's not only a technical problems related to accountants or lawyers or a few professors in economics, but it's political questions that is nowadays raised in a very intensive manner in the UK, in Germany, in Japan, in Brazil, in Canada, in the US. And when journalists 2 years ago had this international scoop, the offshore leaks, and all together at the same time talked about tax havens, about these data they had access to, the same day, they sent a message. They said, we know and people know that this issue is a global one, and we also know that there's a global awareness about this issue. It's not about being the only one to move. And now, usually I'm asked, can Canada behave alone? And the answer to that is why Canada is alone not behaving. Because nowadays, countries like France, like Germany, like the UK, like the US are much more active even though they created that system, they see how problematic it is, and they are much more active than Canada to find solutions. And I think that this question is as much as scientific as political, and we can raise it that way. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open up the floor for a bit. If anybody has questions for Alain, as Alain's, I think, quite happy to engage in some questions and more debate. Oh, Chris.
Interesting talk. A lot I didn't know about, and glad you brought that bad news to us. I'm just curious whether the existing three political parties have a record of responding to this issue in different ways. What's your thoughts about the differences between the Conservatives, the Liberals, and the NDP on this issue, and whether it will become an issue possibly in the next election?
Well, the only party that has an official position on the tax haven issue as a problem is the New Democratic Party. They worked toward toward an international movement trying to tackle some techniques like the transfer pricing. The OECD is under pressure since years to find ways to establish protocols to make sure that companies pay tax where they actually operate. And the problem is that the whole issue should be transferred from the OECD to the UN to make sure that all countries and not only the wealthy ones that benefit from the system participate to the debate, and we could find frameworks to make and it's the direction the NDP has, to make sure that to create could be an international body that make sure that the funds that the profit that are made by companies are taxed in a consolidated way, so that we consider the consolidated data in an international perspective, and we give part of taxes to countries where the corporation actually operates. If it's in the mining sector, in the oil sector, in agriculture, whatever, if a corporation makes 13% of its income in Nigeria, well, that part of its income will be taxed there. And if it makes 40% in Brazil, it would be taxed in Brazil. And that would be the end of tax havens on the fiscal perspective. But the Liberals, as ever, are, we don't know too well where they are, and the Conservative, we clearly know where they stand.
We have two questions simultaneously, so I'll go with the person in the front and then after, so I don't know your names.
I'm a member of the Nova Scotians for Tax Fairness, and recently some of us had the opportunity to have a preview of a video that's, I guess, going to be released next week or something. It's called The Great Canadian Tax Dodge. And the sense that I got from that, and I just want to run this by you, is what maybe some people were on. David Dodge was interviewed, and a number of other interesting people with, currently or formerly significant positions were saying, well, here's the sense I get. Tax law, certainly for corporations and for wealthy people and investors, was written and formulated in a certain way over the years. And what has happened, though, is that corporations and wealthy individuals have hired a cabal of tax lawyers and accountants to look at one aspect of the law, another aspect of the law, first put these things together and figure out legally. So they say that we aren't tax evaders, we're tax avoiders. And anybody like Joe Blow down the road is a tax avoider. And what they're simply doing is using whatever financial resources they have to hire people to go and manage to do things in a certain way. And then one example that was brought up in this documentary is that there was a famous or infamous case of Shell Oil, and I forget what the details of it were, having been prosecuted by the government, by CRA, for some kind of infringement and they didn't pay their supposed just taxes. When it came to going to court, and these things have ended up, by the way, in the Supreme Court of Canada, when you look at the cabal of tax accountants and lawyers that the corporations have, in this one instance, 77, and CRA, Canada Revenue Agency, has 3. And invariably, even though you might look at the Supreme Court of Canada as being in the conservative mentality, people say, well, it's an activist, socially progressive kind of court. When it comes to making judgments about these cases, invariably the corporations and wealthy individuals always win, because they've got the law worked out. Now, there's even a clip of Jim Flaherty saying, after his 10th budget, saying, gosh darn it, 10 times now we've tried to go and sort of get more money out of the corporations, but I guess they just got good people working for them. And so it's almost as if he's saying, of course he, late Minister of Finance, he's a conservative sort of fellow pro-business, but he's almost saying, well, we tried to close the loopholes, but we haven't been able to close the loopholes. So gosh darn it, they're still winning, and this is just the way it is, folks. Can't do anything about it. So how do you respond to that?
I would say that there are 3 problems related to law in a country like Canada. The first one is that Canada as a government, it's one aspect, intensively help corporations to have access to tax havens. For instance, Canada now signs year after year tax, I don't know if it's the proper translation, but tax information exchange agreements. And it is meant officially to tackle the secrecy laws in tax havens. It's meant to allow Canadian officials to inquire on some bank accounts of people that are maybe doing illegal stuff. But in fact, one needs the information it's asking for to obtain the access of the bank account. So it doesn't work, but it's that kind of a treaty. But Canadian government in its law said that if a corporation register assets in a jurisdiction that signed that kind of treaty with Canada, it can bring back the money without paying any tax. So, the specific corridor that existed between the Barbados and Canada now exists everywhere, because the Luxembourg signed the treaty, Bermuda's, Hong Kong, and so on and so forth. So Canada helps tax havens that way. And also Canada signed in 2011, I can't believe it, but a free trade agreement with Panama. And Panama is the major country where people launder money related to drug trafficking. We know it. So when so-called investors from Panama come here, benefiting from this from this free trade agreement, to invest in Canada, they actually integrate Canada in this money laundering system of theirs. And Canada made it possible. And I was personally in the hearings of committees in the Senate and in the House of Commons to talk about that specific criminologist issue. And I can tell you that they were aware of it, but they did as if they didn't understand, because the OECD says that Panama is making so much effort to, I don't know. This is the first point. Canada supports actively and legally the creation of loopholes. Second point is what you mentioned, and it's true, that this is what the government call aggressive practices. So even the laws that exist are circumvented by very clever lawyers that know how to have a bit more. And this is the second, you explained very clearly. And the third point is the judges as such. I mean, law isn't theologic reality. I mean, law doesn't exist as such, and judges make an interpretation of law. And the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu showed how meaningful and important it can be to interpret, to interpret the law. With respect to that case, I think it was a Glaxo corporation, a pharmaceutical corporation, doing transfer pricing with its subsidiary in Switzerland. In that case, I think that judges don't have a clue about tax havens. And when they judge, they don't have this problem in perspective. I mean, they never invited me to give them a talk, but but they don't see it as a problem. They cannot. Maybe it's because it's not in the law. I mean, there's nothing allowing them also to talk about the issue as being a problem. So they are totally inconsistent from decision to decision, because they don't see the topic at all. And when in France there was a commission in the Senate to talk about transfer pricing and the problem it is on a political level, and when in the UK there was a commission when member of parliaments were having people from Apple, from Starbucks, from I don't know which corporation, talking to them and explaining to them why they don't pay a tax in the UK. When all that happened in Canada, the Supreme Court said that the Glaxo Corporation could do transfer pricing. And I won't go into the details. I explained that, but I mean, and it's because they are conservative. They interpret the law in a very corporate way, I would say, and also they don't understand the problem as such, because they are inconsistent from case to case. So what did the government say? That he invited people to write about fiscal shopping in last year, so I sent a report. I mean, people could send report. I don't know what they did with that, and they said, "Please give us advice on the way we could make sure that corporations pay their fair share of tax with respect to the law, but take into account that we won't rip off at all the agreement we signed with tax havens." So, well, they explain to you that they won't consider the only logical solution there is. And they complain that corporations use Luxembourg or Barbados or Hong Kong to avoid taxation, as if there was something else to do in these corporations. And it's all about, making people lose their time.
Okay, we have a question here, then Karen, and then, somebody just stretched. And then Janice.
Thanks for coming and bringing this information. It was good to see you in person after only seeing you through the multiple interviews you've done with Peter Mansbridge and articles in the Report on Business. And we get this story over and over and over and over.